It's a question from Tom Bailey, who says, I see Starmer is often criticised as generating none of the excitement of Blair in 97, but isn't the legacy of Blair at least in part to blame for the scepticism of Starmer?
I like this question, and I just want to address the first part of it first. Generating none of the excitement of Blair in 97. Now, I went to go and dig around in the New Statesman's archive to work out what the feeling was, because you and I were different ages, but we weren't really around for the excitement before Blair, as political journalists at least. And it's interesting because there's a lot of articles in 96 and early sort of January 97, which make many of the same criticisms that Keir Starmer is receiving today. So Steve Richards, our former political editor, wrote a column in January 97 saying that the party was, centralising power away from the membership, which is a criticism of Starmer, at least from the left at the moment. And he suggested that the Labour leadership should be careful making these kind of party constitutional reforms because the membership sometimes knows best. So you hear that criticism now. Then you've got a leader, which is sort of the editorial of the magazine, which suggests that there needs to be further depth to Labour's policy. This is from July 96, so, nearly a year before that election. And it says that, it should be adding more weight to their policy offer in their manifesto. That's something that Starmer hears a lot of today as well. And then from January 97, there's a piece by Charles Clarke, who actually went on to go and serve in the new Labour government, but he'd been chief of staff for Neil Kinnock. And he was saying, opinion polls on everything. The Labour Party now is being accused of shaping its policy based on public opinion. And he's also said that Labour is vulnerable to the charge that Labour has no policies and its policies are the same as the Tories. And that's a danger for them. That's something that Starmer's been accused of. And also that they need to communicate to voters that Labour will bring about a constructive change in society. That's something that comes up a lot now as well. Does Labour in its current form represent any change from the current state of things? So, I'd query, and obviously I'll defer to journalists and politicos who were around in 96 and 97 covering this stuff, but I'd query this idea that there was this huge swell of excitement the year before the 97 election. It's
often retrospective, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think if Keir Starmer wins the next election, he'll be hailed as a revolutionary campaigner who's, a prophet of winning elections, just as Blair's been since then. It's fascinating that we've got such a small data set of historical comparisons that we often, as politicos and journos, we look back and we basically go, okay, is he Blair? Is he Wilson? Is he Attlee? And that's a data set of 3. So it's not that illuminating and it's not that long. No. And we're constantly looking for these historical parallels, basically to explain the present, which can be helpful, but can also be very restrictive. And then on Blair as well, I mean, it's fascinating that those criticisms are so similar.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is I don't think that invalidates them. In many ways, Blair did stick to the Conservative consensus. He said that he wouldn't spend more than the Tories would in the first 2 years. He was adamant that he didn't want to break up the Thatcherite economic consensus. He saw himself, I think, in many ways as the executor of Thatcher's will, and he stuck to her wishes quite a lot. So I don't think he did orchestrate the change, and I think, if anything, we should take those criticisms of Starmer more seriously because they replied to Tony Blair and they came true.
Yeah, well, that's the second part of the question, isn't it? Isn't the legacy of Blair in part to blame for the scepticism of Starmer? Maybe not the scepticism, but the challenge that Starmer faces now. Yeah. This idea that politics, is incredibly narrow now, like you say. Part of that is Tony Blair's part in the Thatcherite consensus, which means that people, feel that then won't necessarily be a particular change, whoever they vote for, which is something that you hear a lot when you speak to voters now. Apathy was a big part of that 97 election win. Okay, it was a big Labour landslide, but there were a lot of Conservative voters who didn't vote. And again, Ben Walker, our polling person, says that might happen this time round. I've spoken to a lot of lifelong Conservative voters in the run-up to various elections and by-elections who have said that they just can't bring themselves to vote at all.
Yeah.
And then also, you've got this idea of accepting the Tories' spending framework, which is what Tony Blair did, which is now the modus operandi for Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And it means that it does detract from any idea of an alternative policy offer, really. We've been speaking time and again. I think each week we come back into this studio and talk about another policy that they've ditched or rowed back on or watered down.
Yeah.
And these articles can prove different things to you. They can prove that that's what Labour needs to do to win, because they did win in the election following the year of these pieces that I've dug out. But they might also suggest that this form of politics has led to a kind of lack of enthusiasm for Labour over the years since.
Yeah. The other thing that's really interesting is what Steve Richards said about the membership. And I think one of the key reasons that Starmer's been able to purge the left from the party in the past 2 years so successfully is that he had the precedent of Blair. He could often say, this is what Blair did, this is what New Labour did, and it was successful because they went on to win. So in many ways, Tony Blair acts as cover or a shield for Keir Starmer to do these unpopular things in his party, because he can say, well, this is how you win. But I said earlier that it was just the journalists and politicos who had this small data set of historical comparisons, but it also seems that Labour are the same. Many people are just obsessed with just looking back to 97 and trying to replicate it, understandably, but the present is obviously very different to the past, and I do think there has been a shift away from some of the economic consensus in the past 3 decades or so. I thought it was remarkable witnessing Keir Starmer, I think, moved towards the 2019 platform that Boris Johnson tried to stand on and did very successfully on. We had those conversations about Keir the Conservative, him adopting the language of Brexit. I thought it was going remarkably well in that regard. And then we have this obsession with fiscal stringency, which is a throwback to the austerity years and the way that they speak about it. I mean, obviously we have a huge question mark of whether they'll actually stick with that when they get into office. That's the big question about Labour at the moment. Will they be more radical when they get in than they promise now? But yeah, that's the concern. I think that's the biggest worry. And if that is the lesson they take from 97, I don't think they will be as radical in power as they perhaps ought to be.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.